I think the industry is still only at 1% of where it should be. And I stick to that. I honestly have no idea how we can be patting ourselves on the back. Still got so much work to do.
Welcome to the Additive Advantage Podcast. I'm Danny Mason, joined by Shon Anderson. This is where additive manufacturing meets accountability, and where we talk about turning pilots into production and ideas into outcomes. Let's jump in.
Today's conversation goes beyond machines and materials into something far more foundational, how additive actually works at scale. For this episode, we're joined by Andre Wegner, CEO of Authentise. They're a leader in flexible AI-powered workflows in the most agile manufacturing and engineering settings. Authentise has taken a little different approach than most in the industry, focusing less on hardware and even beyond traditional software, more on orchestrating the full life cycle of additive production. From workflow continuity to data capture and project-based delivery, this conversation challenges some core assumptions holding the industry back. And I put Andre on the spot about what he would do if he was someone who had just heard what we discussed. In this episode, we'll dig into what it really takes to move additive beyond an isolated use case toward an integrated outcome-driven manufacturing system. And as you'll hear later in the episode, we're also going to be putting our producer, Nicole Dietz, to work on a huge future guest request, and I will hold her accountable for a progress update. So, Nicole, consider this your official introduction. Let's get into it. Welcome to another episode of the Additive Advantage Podcast. This is Shon Anderson. I'm joined today by Andre Wegner from Authentise. And for those of you who tend to think of Authentise as primarily a software company, I think you're going to be impressed by what you hear today. Andre and I have gotten to know each other over the past few months. And as we've shared this passion for making additive really perform at scale, discovered that it isn't just one of us that's crazy. Maybe we're both crazy in how we're looking at this. So eager to jump in and explore that with you this morning. Thanks for joining, Andre.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So what would you want to share with our audience as we start out about your background and about your company before we dig into what it takes to make additive work at scale?
Well, I think we'll get into some of the facets of it, but suffice to say that you and I share a similar passion on the need to remove additive from a sort of island approach to a more cohesive one. We shared that, and your background certainly speaks to that. So it's great to be exchanging those ideas with you. My personal pet peeve is twofold, and Authentise is sort of a reflection of that. Firstly, I don't feel like we have a cohesive operation in additive, and we built a digital infrastructure to support that initially, and we'll get into how we're expanding that now. And the second is, I don't think we're capturing nearly enough data. It's a sort of side story that maybe we'll touch on at the end.
Yeah, I think that'll be a recurring theme that runs throughout because, of course, if you don't have any data, when you think about manufacturing, quality decisions, supply chain decisions, obviously in a non-additive context, you wouldn't ask anyone to make any decisions about those things without data. But for some reason in additive, people forget. So where I would love to start this conversation is maybe going back a little bit to the beginning of how Authentise came to be. You've taken quite a bit different path than most companies in the additive space as you've been building Authentise. Definitely less about hardware, and I'm going to say something maybe slightly provocative. I think even less about software, but more of a focus on production workflows and orchestration. Where did you get the vision for that, or how did you come to believe that that was the right approach?
It came organically. I think the initial mission of Authentise was to enable distributed manufacturing, and we thought initially the only thing that was required was intellectual property protection, and we were very thoroughly wrong with that. So after 3 years of banging our heads against the walls, even though the news media were very excited about us, enabling streaming for additive, we then started listening really close to the customer. And I think that's where this focus on orchestration has really come from. The customer. Initially, Ricoh in Japan, I've got to hat tip them, and more and more companies around the world are beginning to understand that if they want to do this at scale, they have to start thinking about the systems not as an individual system, but how they connect, and increasingly also how they connect to their original intent. Our job, Shon, you and I think we shared this before, is to reduce the time it takes to turn an idea into a part. If we're going to do that, we can't manually exchange every step of the way data in one form to another form. So we really need cohesive approach. The vision of enabling distributed manufacturing is still holds true. It's just that we found that instead of intellectual protection, we need more continuity and integrity to facilitate that mission and vision.
Agreed. It's always been interesting to me that, people talk about additive as speeding up just the time to do the physical production and forget about everything that it takes to, do the design, validate the product with the customer, all of that intent. I love the word that you use there. We think about design intent. Oftentimes we need to think about production intent. And I know that's a topic we're going to get more into in a little bit based on some of the interesting products you guys have been launching. One of the things that struck me in our first conversation is it sounds like have a view of not just making parts, but viewing these additive initiatives as projects. Tell me, how did you come to see this as opposed to just, well, we're just trying to make this widget? It's more of a turnkey project to deliver an outcome. Where did that idea come from?
Yeah, it's an interesting, I'm not sure what the exact origin is. I can tell you that we've always believed that we need to take ownership. And ultimately, we were building workflow software. And our business model is kind of unique in just for selling software. We take a big gamble. So we charge relatively low fees at the front, and then we grow with the customer success. So we really attach ourselves to the customer's KPIs. So we take ownership of the customer's KPIs as well. But there's no better way of doing that than actually to own the infrastructure. And so without, directly competing with the customers, what can we do to facilitate that? So we've been moving ahead in sort of taking more and more ownership. And we became the first software company to become a prime to the DoD. We believe the first software company to become prime to the DoD 3 or 4 years ago in a project for the Air Force in California. And so that's really when we started saying, hey, we can not only deliver a final part to you, but we can deliver it with all the data attached. So we had a competitive advantage to the final customer, and to us, we could say, hey, if anybody knows how to use the software to its full potential, then it's probably us. So that it's just a question of taking ownership and not saddling the customer with my favorite new phrase of the cognitive load of making it work. That's really, really my job. I think that's where it's going. We'll see there's a few avenues where this can be realized in production environments, but also in reverse engineering areas, basically where the market has failed to provide real solutions that the customer wants. And I think that they've left the door wide open for us.
Outstanding. It's amazing how if you just listen well enough to the customer, they'll tell you what to do. You touched on something right there at the end, Andre, about maybe some gaps in the market. I'm curious, when you look at current state of additive, and we just came out of rapid TCT, where do you think the industry is still missing the mark in terms of, maybe incomplete offering or wrong view of what customers are interested in? Where's the gap remaining?
Yeah, it's, we've alluded to that. I think that the OEMs are still very much island makers, and they fail to understand exactly how their tools fit in with the rest of the workflow and ultimately deliver a final part, which is all the customer really wants. They think that the job of producing that production system is really a job for automation system integrators, but I think that's the wrong approach. You leave quality on the table. There's, or productivity opportunities on the table. We've explored how getting data from one system, like a metal additive system, could influence surface finishing parameters later on in the process. So definitely a more integrated view of the data streams makes sense. And the second is that if we just leave it to the system integrators, we will lose agility. Industry 4.0 has basically meant we're going to build these highly sophisticated production systems just for one use case, and that system's going to run forever. We've seen that trend emerge over the last 50, 60 years in the automotive sector and other sectors in the pursuit of efficiency and productivity. And now we're facing this world where we need much more agility, and we're like, maybe that was the wrong approach. So bottom line is I think we've left a lot of room for improvement in the fact that we've seen the additive systems and the individual post processes as individual islands rather than a cohesive system. Very, very briefly, I think the same is also the case in reverse engineering and other engineering processes where the demand is clearly there to produce, millions or reverse engineer millions of designs ready for additive. And yet we're hand holding them from one digital station to another and not thinking about cohesive wholes. So really the island approach is what's leaving us behind.
Agreed. I'm curious, when you think about going from just printing a part, or I'll use that phrase, island approach. By the way, I'm going to steal your phrase, cognitive load, because, as a country boy from South Dakota, I say people don't care how the sausage is made, and avoiding the cognitive load sounds way more sophisticated. So
That sounds smarter, doesn't it?
Or that just reflects the fact that I like food a lot. Who knows? But so
Who
I'm
doesn't like
curious,
sausage?
as you're thinking about building a company and you have this mindset shift from printing a part to project-based additive, there are a lot of implications on the competencies you need in the organization, the mindset of the organization, et cetera. Talk me through how your view has shaped what you've built into Authentise and maybe some of the challenges and some of the victories that have gone along with, building the company differently.
Yeah, I mean, some of it was intentional, and I would say some of it was pure luck. A couple of things happened. The first is that we're not venture backed. We build a company that has investors, and we have largely built the company on the back of the dollars that we made, which meant that we have a lot more freedom. We don't have venture capitalists jumping down our back saying, hey, you must do X. Recurring revenues has been the leitmotif until recently of all the VCs. And that's distracted people from doing things that might bring you dollars, but not recurring dollars, right? And so we were lucky in part. I mean, I used to run a venture capital fund, and I instinctively knew that venture was not the right approach for a company in the industrial space because it's a signal poor environment and sales cycles are super long. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I used to also work in the microfinance industry where hybrid structures are quite common. So you have microfinance banks that are banks and then also have a charitable arm. And I started in a similar vein thinking about, well, there's a lot of innovation funding, but I know innovation funding might distract my commercial aims. So let me build an organization that is separate, that just focuses on innovation funding, uses the same infrastructure, but it is for all intents and purposes separate. So that's what we did. And we have a great business working with governments around the world on innovation projects. And that's been going on for about 5 or 6 years. So the transition to project work was not really that difficult because A, we didn't have anybody shouting at us that we shouldn't do it. And B, we had a really competent team that was familiar with launching complex projects and executing them, right? Which are what innovation projects are. So we just transitioned that approach to the commercial side, and especially in the defense market, that goes without saying. The third ingredient, I think, is that we've had a few incredible customers who've trusted us from an early stage. I mean, the DoD taking a punt on us to work on a multi-million-dollar project. People had to put their names on the line for that, and I do appreciate that. And so we've worked with some really incredible people and organizations along the way.
It's amazing how, and you have to take a man's word for it when he says, well, I used to work as part of a VC organization and I recognized it wasn't the right fit. We always say that customer dollars are better funding than investor dollars, right? Because investor dollars validate that you made a compelling pitch. Customer dollars validate that you actually solved a real problem. And
It's true.
Better implications there.
I mean, I had to learn it the hard way, Shon, but yeah. I learned it in the end.
Well, you did learn it in the end. I don't know if our industry has learned it yet, but
Oh, certainly not if the number of hype cycles go speak for
yeah,
anything.
I think, you have a lot of companies out there just hoping that there's one more hype cycle left. I'm curious, when you think about this project-based additive model, what types of customers or applications do you see as best suited for that model for where the industry is today?
You know what? Um, I'm not entirely certain that this requires a fully fledged application driven model. I do think that, there's an obvious fit to deploy factories for applications that are single purpose, that require a specific fit, missile shells or suppressors. You can also think about highly flexible factories, and obviously we have many of those. A line makes 1 million parts a day, unique parts a day. So I think flexibility is also interesting, especially in certain environments. So, we're involved in a German project for lights out metal additive manufacturing, led by a company called ZF. And this is public. They are interested in the long tail of parts, right? And so they're going in it without the idea of a specific application that needs to be run. There's also projects that are being requested from defense departments around the world in the areas of contested logistics. Again, you're dealing with environments that are multi-purpose. So, it fills the whole thread of different applications spectrum.
Interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project you mentioned in Germany, where you talk about the long tail focus on the parts? When you think about we've talked a lot about the reverse engineering focus on the front end of things, and there are other players in the space. You see what Worth Additive is doing, launching their DIS, where, their core business is really the long tail, but traditionally manufactured. And now they're wading into the, digital inventory concept. Again, thinking about the what I would call consumption over time. What can you share with us about that project, and what is motivating the impression I got is that's an agile or flexible factory by design. How does the demand signal get connected to what's being built in that project today based on the long-term view? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And if I'm not answering the question correctly, you can always throw something at me. The intent behind the project really steered the project in a very different way. So it's not only focusing on, automating the process, the additive process. It's also automating things that hadn't previously been automated, like support removal. And it's doing that for unique shapes. So you're generating toolpaths separately every time. If you're thinking that backwards, you're also going to have to think about orienting, supporting, adding barcodes, tooling points, so you have a lot of, build preparation work that's going on that also has to be automated, because if you're going to want to have a high throughput factory that has this flexibility, you have to keep on thinking in different ways. So that's the intent drives a lot of design decisions that wouldn't normally be considered in a normal automation project, which is go back to my point is if you have like, when Carbon went out and started making the shoe, they had just the midsole in mind and bam, this is all we got to do. Please help me automate this process. An agile factory thinks differently.
Understood. As you're building Authentise, so this workforce is a topic that comes up a ton on this podcast. And so anytime we have a business leader on, I try to at least touch on it a little bit. Of course, they all view it through a little bit different lens. And I'm curious, based on what you've shared with us about Authentise, what are the skills that you believe are hardest to find right now in the additive space as you're building your company?
That's really interesting. I think deep domain knowledge is still really valuable. So if I just spoke to a chap who's been the technical data package focal for the Navy for 20 years. That's gold. Speaking to people like that, understanding what their real challenges are, trying to drive home, what the latest tools can do to help them and really work in a collaborative manner to address that. getting rid of the grind that they don't really want to engage with. And that really brings me to like a higher level point. I think that, and I've seen it in my own company right now. If you have an interest, if you want to break it down, if you want to dive deeper, a curiosity is part of your hallmark. So, you're going to be fine, and no matter what the changing environment is. At Authentise, we're heavily basing our products on AI. That doesn't mean that the use of AI throughout Authentise is, all at the same level. It's really interesting to see how curiosity differs with different people, and how as a result, the adoption of AI tools might differ with different people, and you have to make a real effort. So that's a skill. Curiosity is a learned skill, and has a lot to do with your background and the way you were brought up. It's something that you can still learn, and I hope that people do.
I love that. That's the first time I've heard someone talk about curiosity as a skill, but I would absolutely agree. It's vital to building a company that can evolve and remain agile as customer needs evolve. I want to go back to something you shared earlier. We talked about, hardware OEMs oftentimes kind of as islands, but let's look at it through more of a software lens. Talk to me about, when you think about current tools, so from MES systems to workflow software, data management, you've got engineering, workflow and design tool sets in the tech stack. Where does all that fall short? When you think about the software side, what's missing there?
And a couple of things. Traditionally, the thing that people have mostly complained about is that they are all islands the same way the equipments are. You're talking about your CAD tool, your simulation tool, talking about your support generation tool and slicer, and then you've got an in-process monitoring tool maybe. There's dozens of, I call them heavy math algorithms that sit along that pipe that need to be integrated. And that's really what the workflow systems are there to do. A lot of them, just stopped innovating basically and stopped doing that. The other thing is that there's a whole slew of data, Shon, that I think has even more value that we've largely ignored, primarily, I think, because we didn't think it was possible to use it. And that's the contextual collaboration data that we generate every day, the emails that you and I send, and the Teams or Slack messages, the random Google Drive draft documents that we've got, and anything, basically, the transcripts from the video calls that we have. And all that information is used and it's becoming increasingly valuable because we realize how important context is for AI. But we've always dismissed it. So not only do we have algorithmic islands, we also have data islands. We have these pieces of information that we've never previously thought to utilize. And so the software market is really, really poor in its evolution because it hasn't managed to combine those two things and is still claiming success. We won an award at Rapid, and I got up and I'm like, I think the industry is still only at 1% of where it should be. And I stick to that. I honestly have no idea how we can be patting ourselves on the back. We've still got so much work to do.
I think you touched on something there that, everybody has to talk about AI now, or, you feel like you're irrelevant, except most people talk about AI and they're still using it to plan their vacation with their wife, saying, what are the top?
It sounds a lot easier, doesn't it?
Yeah. But you touched on something that is so important because, I don't care if you're a Grok, Claude, Chat, whatever, context is everything. And if you don't give, regardless of the model, if you don't give it context, you will not get a very good answer. And I love the fact that you're calling out, Andre, that if we don't start capturing context around decisions of why was the part designed this way? Why didn't we do that? How come we chose this, whether it's surface finish, machining, whatever it is, but all of the whys. If we don't start capturing that now, AI is going to continue to give us junk answers for another 10 years.
It's astonishing to me. Thank you. It's a cross I will die on, and it's something we've invested significant resources in. I can't believe we're going. One of the reasons the industry is the size it is today is because a lot of the traditional parts won't be reverse engineered because it's just simply too difficult to do it because we don't have those whys recorded properly. And so for every part, we have to go back to first principles, which means $1 million effort in most cases, and or more than that. And the traditional platforms, think about the commercial airlines, just won't do that. They won't certify parts again, right? So we're stuck waiting for new platforms to arrive, which barely ever do, right? And as a result, our market, our total addressable market is much smaller than it ought to be. And yet, despite that constraint, now when we engineer a new product today, or even reverse engineer a new product today, we're still not making any effort to capture the why, knowing for sure that there will be a new manufacturing capability available to us in 6 months' time, 12 months, 24 months. There will be something. It's insane to me that it's like Einstein's, the definition of insanity is you keep on banging your head and saying, well, it's true. Like that's what we're doing. So yeah, it's something that we are, Whisper, the new product we released, is absolutely kind of one of the things that we're really trying to address. But I acknowledge it's a hard road to climb because it's a behavior change. It's people acknowledging that information that they considered not to be valuable is suddenly valuable, and we need to find methods of capturing it.
Well, people forget that it's valuable until you want to reverse engineer a part. And, one of our applications, people will be talking to a customer and be like, well, why does the part have this feature? It doesn't seem, I can't tell what the purpose is. Why? Well, the guy that designed that, he retired like 20 years ago. And, we didn't make any notes on the drawing.
Yeah, and
So,
then if you're lucky if you have the drawing,
yeah, if there is a drawing, but even if there is a drawing, you don't get 50 pages of emails attached to it that explain, why is this curve this radius and why, because it would seem, intuitively obvious to do it differently. Why didn't you? There must be a good reason. And what I see happen oftentimes is, we use the phrase defam as an excuse to throw out original design intent. It's like, well, we don't know what that feature was really for. We defamed it, which is code for changed it in a way that might make it not work.
Good point.
Too
Good
often.
point. Yeah.
Again, just
Yeah, I
letting
mean,
some of my-
this is part of making it a more cohesive system, right? Is that we stop a tradition, a well-trodden tradition of throwing things over the wall. The engineer is done, goes to the manufacturing engineer. Damn, don't see it anymore. It's if you really want to reduce the time it takes to turn an idea into a part, you can't have those walls anymore. You have to make it a single journey. And that also means understanding what the previous people did and what the next people are likely to have to do.
One of the things that's interesting to me about your new product, Whisper, and I'll be interested to see if you share this view, but in business, my experience is most of the issues happen at the junctures. You just talked about the engineer throws it over the cube wall to the manufacturing engineer, and ideally you'd eliminate the wall and you'd eliminate those junctures. But what I've found is rarely does the problem happen within a function. Not never, but seldom.
I mean, the
When
most
things
famous
have to
example
things
is
have to
the
transition across those junctures, that's where things go wrong, and it would seem to me like, we need Whisper to apply to, strategic execution across junctures in every context, not just manufacturing. I mean, and not to blow up your product roadmap, but maybe you guys need to
I
tackle
think
that
you're
on a
right.
grander scale.
I believe, obviously people are working on context engines. Much larger companies are working on context engines. And I think that in the manufacturing engineering space, we may have a niche where it makes sense to have a kind of specialized tool set. But having said that, the concept is still so novel that it certainly might apply. And, we're fairly embedded in the defense industry. So we do get asked from time to time, hey, can you have a look at this problem set? So I'll go wherever somebody says, I acknowledge that this is an issue and that, we need to start working on it at this point in the company. But yeah, it is a problem across industries. And my expectation is that it will be addressed in the next few months and years as people realize how valuable context is as a result of using AI for the first time.
It is key, not only obviously in manufacturing, but when I look at all of, people say we're going to leverage AI And, when you look at what companies are doing, one of the things that's different, I'll call it, about this workspace disruption is usually when there's a workforce disruption, it kind of starts at the front line and slowly the wave ripples its way up in an organization and kind of upper middle management generally isn't impacted too much. AI, completely the opposite. If you're the delivery driver who actually hands a product to someone, or you are the lineman that climbs a telephone or climbs an electrical pole to maintain electrical service, ChatGPT ain't going to do that. But the, executive vice president of such and such that basically takes data from down here and turns it into a pretty report to send up to the senior executives, that woman or that man's job is becoming superfluous. And the problem is without a context engine, unfortunately, some of the decision making that used to happen in that woman or in that man's head before the data got fed up, now that's gone. And now we're feeding data. What does it mean? Don't know.
I
Why
know.
why does the data say this? Don't know. And I think when people and organizations want to say, well, AI is too immature, I'm not getting good output, the first thing you have to do is look at, well, what are you telling it? If you're not
Yeah.
giving it any context.
I mean, 10 years ago when I was teaching at Singularity, I used to say engineers would be turned into constraint managers, right? And constraint is another way of defining context, right? And so that it's become clear that to me, this evolution doesn't mean that we are going to be, making people redundant en masse, not necessarily at least. They're not necessarily superfluous. I'm working harder with the aid of AI than I ever have before. So if I'm anything good, I think possibly not. But I do think that there's a context is going to make better decisions, allow the AI to take grunt work off our hands faster, and allow the creative work of deciding where those constraints should lie to fall back to the managers. And that's really what drives us in our industries, defining the strategic vision, right? Shon, and you and I are the same way. And then letting the system execute it. And so my hope is that we can get there faster as a result of context.
I pray that you are right. And I think it's a great opportunity to revisit the concept of best and highest use, right? Best and highest use of a person is not combing through Excel, generating some report, right? Or tweaking the graph on the slide deck for the management meeting, right? That's best and highest use of nobody. Those are the things that should be automated. And then, yes, you do need a human brain involved in, taking that output and discerning meaning, charting it against strategy, et cetera. But companies that fail to build context into and capture context in their workflows will be decades behind in their ability to harvest value from AI. That's my prediction.
No, I'm 100% with you. And I mean, we may be biased because we work in the manufacturing sector that is relatively agile and not limited by legacy. But I have yet to encounter somebody who's really throwing themselves against changing the status quo, right? This is not about, everybody that I met is like, oh, you want to take away my grunt work? Yeah, please take away my grunt work. Like, I don't like doing this work, right? I've tried to get everybody in my team to create a piece of software at least once a month, even the commercial people, because, I think that understanding that now we can think about the kind of constraints that we're under in a different way. We can remove them. We can change our mental model of what is possible to do as a result of AI. Really changes the playing field. I'm hopeful that nobody will have to go through lots of Excel sheets anymore, but I still see it happen. And when it does happen, I spend an hour coding up an automation and being like, I want to consider this in the future.
Well, I can guarantee you that, especially in large organizations, and this is the kind of back to the people side of technology, when leaders don't consider how to implement technology for the benefit of their people, the people are, it's human nature, they're going to dig their heels in. And so you have, the person who crunches data out of some Excel sheet, crunching it even harder to demonstrate how valuable it is now because they haven't been shown the benefit and their future role. Like, hey, if we could again, maybe it takes an hour, maybe if we've never done it before, maybe it takes us a day. right? To write up an automation that'll comb what we want to comb out of this data. But oh my gosh, even if we had to spend an entire day, if we only did that once,
Yeah, and there's a really this goes back to the days of RPA, um, and the fact that there's always been a move towards automating all kinds of different things. We have to be careful. We obviously don't want to automate something that takes a minute once every 3 months, with a day's worth of labor. But yeah, it's a theme that's been going on. It's now a powerful tool in everybody's hands to address those automation opportunities. But we do have to make sure that everybody understands that tool exists and uses it wisely, for sure.
agreed. So I want to get back a little bit to, let's pretend for a minute that you are listening to this podcast and, you run manufacturing for some company and your boss has said, "Hey, Andre, we need to be leveraging additive better." And you just heard these two guys, incredibly handsome guys, intelligent, go on and on about how we need to think differently about additive. We need to, think of it more on a project basis, reduce the cognitive load. You've heard all this good discussion. Where would you start if you were that manufacturing leader? What would you go do based on what you've heard in this podcast today, as opposed to maybe the old approach of, well, I guess I'm going to call Stratasys and hope that they have a machine that can make my...
I'm assuming at this point, the conversation has moved on from how do we leverage additive in the organization, and you're thinking strategically about how to make additive core to your business, right? We've been through 30 years of this industry. If you're still interested, you're still coming to Stratasys and whoever and thinking, hey, what do I do with this technology? And you may want to start there, start tools, jigs, and fixtures. But every business is being pushed in a completely new way, especially in the last few years, right? Missile stocks are running out, and car manufacturers have to shift their production locations, and all kinds of things are happening. And so there are areas in your business that are very, very stressed. And the question is, how can you leverage additive to make that happen? And don't be afraid of, but additive's expensive, and additive is this. Ask yourself, how can you make that happen? And very interesting projects going on at, the missile companies right now, really identifying the technology that works and automating it to the hilt, to making sure that technology can deliver to their specific use case. It's phenomenal. Like the amount of effort and energy being put into that, because somebody stands behind it with the vision that says, there's a need here. I know this technology can work. It's going to require work to get that in place, but we're not afraid of to do that. So really what you got to do, instead of going to a machine vendor, got to go find yourself a partner. I had a friend who worked for one of Align's competitors, Clear Aligner company, and built, an Align competitive manufacturing outfit in Kentucky or Tennessee, out of nowhere, out of nothing. And you'd see him walk around with this guy who was, for all intents and purposes, a reseller, but really just a partner, a project delivery partner who would help him understand what automation opportunities were required, who'd help him think through the project, understand his aims, help bring and surface new technologies to his attention. So, really the reality is, find yourself a partner, somebody that you trust, that you can work with, that is going to help you deliver this thing. Doesn't want all the cake for himself, but is happy to share it. And wants to work with you on an outcome-based basis. That's what I would say you should be looking for. But it really depends. If you're still looking for how do I use additive in my business, probably not the right way of going about it in the first place.
What I would normally tell people is that no matter where you are, picking a partner before you are too wrapped around the part is a good idea, because it could prevent 5 years of wasted money and time.
That's true.
I hear you loud and clear, Andre, with your comment about, well, hopefully people are thinking about how to use additive as a strategic advantage, not just how do we make some parts. But the majority of companies that we talk to, I would say there's a top 15% that are thinking about additive as a strategic capability. And then there's the middle, I would say 65% under the bell curve who maybe tried this, failed, and have now slipped back to, can we just find a project that this can actually perform on?
Yeah. Yeah, it's challenging, isn't it? Especially if you don't necessarily have well, you and I know that if we're running companies, we're constantly distracted by 1,000 different issues, right? And so trying to make a technology work in a specific area is always going to be hard to justify. But yeah, to, well, put it this way, I think that many people, just the same way people aren't considering the contextual collaborative data as valuable, I think people are dismissing additive opportunities out of hand, often because they don't, they've had those negative experiences and they don't think that it's truly scalable. They just want one little example, as you point out. But really, this technology has arrived and it's possible to derive significant values. Think about all you know, I started last year predicting that there'd be 5 use cases, of 1,000,000 parts each, that would arrive. And really there's been more than that. Just think about the suppressors and so forth that have really come to the market lately. It is possible to drive real value with these tools, not just marginal value. And if you want to persuade your C-level that this is a tool that can really last, then you have to start thinking big, is my view, rather than those marginal opportunities. So that's where the projects come in, right? And that's where we generate value with the customer.
Love that. I think there was some great advice in that. Kind of coming back to a little bit of your leadership journey. What's something that you've learned in building a company in this space that you think others could benefit from?
Stay afloat.
Yeah, that's important. That's
N-
important.
um, we're really truly blessed with partners, both internal and external, that have seen the value and have worked with us. I can just think about the team that we won the work that we won the award for at Rapid was work that we've done in the reverse engineering space. And it's largely based on the feedback that we've received over the years from Boeing and the support we've received over the years from Boeing. Boeing Global Services. And that's been really interesting, really understanding where their pain points are, listening really deeply, but their willingness to tell us and to pay us to address those pain points has been really, really important. So, having both partners that are willing to share and a team that is willing to continue to go on journeys and address those pain points is the most important thing that I've learned. I started this company as effectively a solo founder, started with others, but then they all left. It felt like a lonely journey for a long time. But now with these partners and these, the internal partners that we have, it's a completely different ballgame. It's really, really interesting. So lessons I've learned while building in this space, I think, find yourself your right partners. Come back to my earlier point.
A lot of wisdom there. And you touched on something that we found to be so important, which is, a partner that will help bring a problem to you, but then is willing to write a check to have the
Mm-hmm.
problem solved. And that's,
Yeah.
you know, one of the measuring sticks we use here is, how big of a problem is this? If they're not willing to write a decent sized check, we're not working on the right problem.
I think
And
that's it. Yeah. It's been interesting. One of the things that we did when we transitioned from IP protection to sort of workflow approach was to say, look, if somebody wants a feature badly enough in our software, they'll pay us for it. We estimate that 85% of all our features have been paid for by external customers, and that's been really as a result of us saying, no, we're not going to build it yet. We know that this is important. We're not going to build it yet because we want somebody to guide us and tell us exactly how it should be built, and too often we built things that just weren't ready for. So I think listening, having customers that are willing to pay for it is a very important indicator for how important that feature really is, whether it's a new machine or a software feature.
yeah, it's that how do how do you validate, I'm going to use a generic term, but product market fit or feature market fit before you build it? You get somebody
Difficult,
to pay you
yeah.
to do it, right?
And that was also the interesting thing with Whisper, right? Did it with a group of partners we put on a steering committee and we said, you believe in this problem, right? Yeah, they did. Well, pay us some money in advance and pay us more when we built for it.
Mm-hmm.
And this was this is the first time I've ever done that for a completely new product. They had no reason to believe in us whatsoever. It's fascinating to see that it's actually working. And I think, Shon, we can speak from like a high chair about this stuff because we've been in the market for a while, you and I. It's easy now to generate the trust necessary to make those kinds of, or get people to make those kinds of bets because we've been around for a while. We can tell people we know what we're doing, and that we can deliver, and we will deliver on those promises. Otherwise, people wouldn't put their name down for And these are people's professional futures as well, right? They're gambling on you. Nobody's ever been fired for hiring IBM. Now it turns out that they trust Authentise enough to not be fired.
Yeah. And it's amazing you talk about your story and, maybe we'll do I think it would be interesting to do another podcast and simply talk about the importance of partnerships in building a business. But you talked about Boeing early on, B9 Creations. We had a moment where we had a customer write us a multiple six-figure check to build them something to a specification we'd never built a product to. And at the time, I think we were a 12-person company.
Wow.
And that, finding someone who believes in you enough to say, this is a big problem, or in this case, it was a big opportunity. We need this. We're trusting you to deliver this. And then when you deliver and you hit it out of the park, it inspires not only confidence in the customer, but the confidence in your team to say yes to things with big unknowns, like this focus group around Whisper, right? To say, hey, we see this need for I love that phrase, context engine. I'm stealing a lot of your language today, Andre, by the way.
Well, we're sharing here, yeah.
But, to say we all agree that leveraging AI requires an enormous amount of context. Can we find people who are committed enough to having this problem solved to write checks to pay us to do it? And that's how companies are built. I always tell people the number one way a small technology company goes out of business is by making products people don't buy. And when you can get customers to pay for it before you build it, you can solve that problem or inoculate yourself against that potential disease in advance.
Well, small companies have many disadvantages, right? So we have to find advantages that compensate to that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, I always tell people that we're exploring partnerships with is, the advantage that you have working with someone like a B9 Creations, or I'm guessing similar to your company, is if you've got a big enough priority, you can make it my priority, right? If you're calling Stratasys, you're probably not going to get Yoav to significantly change what's on his to-do list for the next 90 days. But if it's solving a problem that we believe is key to the future of the industry and seeing manufacturing thrive in, this very hostile global environment, if the customer's committed enough, we'll make the whole company committed to it.
Exactly.
It just has to be strategically, the old phrase, strategically aligned and tactically defined.
Yeah, good phrase. See, that's one I'll take from you. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Andre, this has been fantastic.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I don't know how many podcasts you consume on a regular basis. I learned something over the weekend. This is a little off the beaten path, but we're going to give Nicole a to-do item. I watched the Theo Vaughn podcast with Ella Langley, and I'm convinced that for Additive Advantage to get to the next level, if we could get Ella Langley on here, I think we could open this podcast up to a whole new, realm of viewers and start teaching a lot more people about 3D printing. So
yeah,
we're going to have
definitely
Nicole
an aspect of having a broader audience. That's for sure.
Yes. I don't know how much American country music you listen to, Andre, but if you haven't checked out Ella Langley,
it's on my listen to list now.
Yeah. You're going to have to fire up Spotify and check it out. The podcast she did with Theo Vaughn was pretty hilarious. You see a lot of artists who, they cut an album in a studio and you have auto tune and all these things. She's in the podcast venue with him and she's just singing, and love the authenticity and the bravery. And yeah, it was pretty cool. So anyway, future Additive Advantage episode with Ella Langley. Nicole's going to work on that. Um, well, have a great week, Andre. Please stay in touch. And I've made a couple of notes here about maybe a future episode we need to come back and do together.
well, well, it sounds like you've got your roster all sorted there for a while at least. It's been really fun, Shon. Thank you for the chat. Really appreciate it.
Outstanding. Have a great day.
You too. Ciao. Bye.
What a cool conversation to be able to talk with someone whose philosophy about project-based additive looks similar to ours. And one of the things that really stood out to me was his idea about shifting from printing parts to delivering projects. Do you think the industry is ready for that shift?
Well, I don't know if the industry is ready. I think customers are ready and actually demanding it. Because when you think about, implementation of whether it's additive or you're going to stand up a new milling line, anything like that, it's really a project to bring that capability online. And I think when you wrap around what it takes to execute a project, so clearly defined, scope, schedule, budget, expectations, all those things, and then this concept that you might have a project team that is different than the run it when it's done team. I think it's another great example of how we don't need to reinvent the wheel to make this work. We need to take some best practices from other places. Andre, as he spoke about this, he talked about, at the end being able to kind of, hand the thing over to the customer. Parts are coming out, systems are automated, QA QC processes are in place. I mean, that's what people want. And I'm going to steal his phrase. They don't want to deal with the cognitive load of what it takes to make all that happen. Again, I don't know if the industry's ready or not. Customers are demanding it.
Yeah, that brings a point up too when you talk about being able at the end to hand over a whole process. He talks a lot about this island problem between machines and software and data. Where do you see that breaking down kind of in the real world additive environments that we interact with?
Well, it's interesting that when we started out, I asked him before we started recording, I said, are you okay if I say that I don't really think of Authentise as a software company? or am I going to, trouble anyone if I make that statement? But I loved his perspective because, he talks about the islands of hardware, materials, software, or even we got into, generically we tend to say, well, if it's software, I hate the word ecosystem, but it's this ecosystem. We talked about MES systems, slicers, all the different pieces of software, which are really still islands because they're not integrated. There isn't an overarching workflow. And until you put that together, I think part of his point, and certainly my belief, is that's where additive has the opportunity to outperform traditional manufacturing. Because if we're honest, you go into most factories, that entire workflow in a traditional manufacturing context is also largely made up of islands, even though a lot of that technology has been around a long time. For most people, if you think about going all the way from the system you use to order your incoming raw materials to the system that your customer uses to place an order and receive whatever that finished product is going out the door, that's not integrated. Now, there are certain parts of it you could make an argument maybe don't need to be, but there are a ton of parts of that that should be integrated. Again, here's an opportunity for additive where realistically, most of the time, additive is not going to be the easiest way to do something. But if you can also leverage additive, whether it's for the flexibility, distributed production, all those traditional reasons, and have it be the most integrated production capacity on your floor, that's a tremendous opportunity. And I thought he really keyed in on that when he said, actually, I asked him, pretend you're the leader of a manufacturing organization who's been tasked with implementing an additive. And he said, well, gee, Shon, I hope nobody's thinking of it like that anymore. I hope people are thinking about, well, how do we better integrate additive into our strategy? And we had a nice little back and forth over, I think those of us that live in the industry would hope everyone's there. In reality, I think most people are not there because that hasn't been their experience. Again, to your point about islands, oftentimes they've had trouble just getting one island stood up successfully. And then, how many projects have you seen where it's like, ooh, we got the part designed the way we want it. Hey, we think we even found a material that will work. And it prints on this printer. Now we want to make 100,000 of them. And it doesn't work at scale.
Yeah.
So, again, real opportunity in my mind to bring technology to the production floor in an integrated fashion, and it just happens to be additive because that's where so many people are investing right now.
Yeah, he made another good point too, to focus on the context and the why behind the decisions. Why do you think, or do you think, companies aren't doing this, and what are kind of the consequences of not just the connecting of islands, if you will, but understanding the context of why you made the decisions you did?
Oh my gosh, I would love to say that everybody is working on this, Danny, but that would probably be a little bit Pollyanna-ish of me. Hopefully the motivating factor would be this. If you work in a manufacturing company today and you haven't heard this conversation, I'll send you $1. Just message me with your email and your name and your address at the end of the episode. I'm going to send you $1 if you can honestly say you've never heard this conversation. Hey, here's a part. We need to move the tool to a different molder, or we need to set up a different, we're going to move this from this milling line to this milling line. Does anyone know where the drawing is? Well, hey, good news. We found the drawing. Does anybody know why we designed it this way? Like, why is this feature like this? Because I could reduce my setups. If I could eliminate this radius, I could have one less setup in the production process. Well, Bill designed that, and Bill retired 10 years ago. We could probably call him, but he's on this fishing boat off the coast of Florida. Now, again, maybe there's a few variations in the version that you've heard, but I will send you $1 if you can tell me you're in a manufacturing company and you've never had a conversation like that. The point of all this is context is so important. And it's part of why, in my mind, Authentise isn't just a software company. Software is certainly the medium that they use to do what they do. But when you think about, I think at this point, we're comfortable hearing people talk about large language models, AI engines. He talked about a context engine. When you can document, why is this feature this way? Do we really need this radius here? Because it requires an extra setup, and that costs me more money in terms of what I machine off, labor. I need to know why that's there. Otherwise, I'd quit doing it. When we can document those decisions all the way through the design and pre-production process and, first article and then the revisions that get made, and we're capturing all of the back and forth, whether it's in Slack, Teams, email, et cetera. And you think about, AI agents now taking meeting notes. We have the ability today, not at some distant point in the future, but today, to capture all of that. And then 5 years from now, when that question comes up, they're like, oh, well, Rachel designed that part. She's moved on to another job, but let's leverage our context engine to figure out why that radius is there. Well, if getting value out of AI is all about giving it context. If I just upload, a scan of this part and say, why is this radius here? I'm going to get a garbage answer. But if I built a context engine, I have the opportunity to reap tremendous benefits in the future, but it's a little bit like planting a tree. If I don't plant it today, I won't reap the benefits in, 5 or 10 years. Same thing with this context engine concept. And it's one of the areas I think Andre and his team are way out in front of most companies, which is where they need to be. But if you want to get better value out of AI, figure out how to give it more context.
Yeah, what a great spot to end on, the idea of, are you powering the context engine of your business? I love that. Incredible conversation.
So we do have a couple of other things. Nicole, can you is there anything that you can share about us getting Ella Langley booked for the Additive Advantage? She's shaking her head. Does that mean there's nothing we can share, just nothing we could say publicly? I think she just means we can't say anything publicly yet, but anyway, we'll keep you updated. I don't know why country music and additive manufacturing haven't really partnered together up till now, but we're going to do our best to break that barrier down.
Follow the Additive Advantage podcast on Apple and Spotify and watch full episodes on YouTube. If this was helpful, leave us a 5-star review on Apple or rate us 5 stars on Spotify. It helps the show grow. And you can follow us on LinkedIn for new episodes and updates. Thanks for listening.